Chapter 3 Mrs. Kimmel-Farber's Problem. There was silence in the room for about 2 seconds. Then there was a riot. All the girls began to giggle. The boys chortled and chuckled and laughed right out loud. Henry turned red, and Mrs. Kimmel-Farber, who did not appreciate the humor at all, turned white. She rapped her ruler against the desk and shouted for silence. "Henry Green," she said, "what is the meaning?" "Little brown spots all over," said Henry. "I was looking at my arm, and I have these." "Little brown spots all over," interrupted Mrs. Kimmel-Farber. "I heard you quite clearly." "But you see, Mrs. Kimmel-Farber, I didn't have them all of my life. I didn't even have them this morning, but now—" "I know," said Mrs. Kimmel-Farber. "Now you have them all over. I'd better have a look at them." Taking Henry's arm, she led him to the window. She said as she peered at his arms. "Looks like freckles to me." "No, ma'am," said Henry, it just can't be." "Why not?" asked Mrs. Kimmel-Farber. "Because I have clear and delicate skin, like my mother." "Is that so?" asked Mrs. Kimmel-Farber. "And who told you that? Please tell me." "My father." said Mrs. Kimmel-Farber. "Exactly. Now, you are sure you didn't observe this phenomenon before this morning?" "If that means did I see them, no, I didn't." "Well, then," she said, "you, Henry Green, stand right where you are, and class," she said, turning to face the room, "you will continue to look at your books until I return. In perfect silence," she added as she went out into the hall. Henry stood as told while the class looked at him. Mrs. Kimmel-Farber walked the few steps down the hall to Mr. Ponolo's room. She looked through the doorway and waited for Mr. Ponolo glanced in her direction. Catching his eye, she waved him out into the hallway. "Listen, Phil," she began earnestly. "I want you to take a look at this kid." "For heaven's sakes, Dolores," said Mr. Ponolos. "I'm right in the middle of Americus Vespucci. I have no idea what that is. Who has little spots all over his arms." "Little brown spots? You got me out here for little brown spots?" "I thought maybe measles." "Oh, no," said Mr. Ponolos. Pangolis. "Chicken pox?" Said the teacher. "I'd better take a look." The two of them turned Henry to the light near the window, right near the corner where the potted plants were growing on the window ledge. Mr. Ponolos poked and prodded and even took his eyeglasses out of his pocket to put them on. They're observing him and looking at him so intently, trying to figure out what these little brown dots are. I first thought maybe chicken pox, too. "Freckles," he finally said. "Just freckles." "Are you sure?" Mr. Ponolos's round nose twitched and sniffed the air. "Chocolate?" he said. "Have they brought the chocolate milk upstairs already?" "Forget the milk!" cried Mrs. Kimmel-Farber. "Look! Now he has them on his face!" "Oh, no," said Henry. "Oh, yes," said Mrs. Kimmel-Farber. "Oh, my," said Mr. Ponolos. "And they weren't there before?" "No! 2 minutes ago the boy's face was as clear as day, and now—" Henry felt as if his heart were about to drop into his shoes. He swallowed hard and stared at the two teachers who were staring at his face. "Little brown spots all over," said Mrs. Kimmel-Farber, "and I see more of them coming out even as we speak." A tear, just one, welled up in Henry's right eye and began to trickle down his cheek, running slowly in and out of the little brown spots. Chapter 4. Pop! Dirt breeds germs. Nurse Molly would often say, and germs have a nasty way of making healthy people ill. Naturally, the nurse's office of PS 123 was always spotless, because Nurse Molly wouldn't have it any other way. And naturally, as Mrs. Kimmelfarber and Henry rushed through the door that morning, she made both of them go back and wipe their feet on the mat. "And don't bring any of your cocoa in here," Nurse Molly added. She sniffed the air loudly. "Cocoa?" asked Mrs. Kimmelfarber. "Don't think I don't smell it," Nurse Molly said. "Please, Nurse Molly," said Mrs. Kimmelfarber, "we have an emergency on our hands. This is Henry Green. He's breaking out in a rash of some sort." "So I see," said Nurse Molly. She sat Henry down in a chair and turned on a bright light. Pushing her spectacles down to the tip of her nose, she bent close to Henry and looked at him all over. "It's a rash, all right," she said at last. Peculiar. Looks like little brown spots all over." "Exactly," Mrs. Kimmelfarber said. "But what is it?" "Have you ever had the measles?" Nurse Molly asked. "Yes," Henry said, "when I was 5. "Chickenpox?" "When I was 3.5. "Then I would say you have an unidentified rash, and frankly, I don't like the look of it." Henry, who up until now was nearly frightened, began to feel terrified. Nurse Molly laid her cool hand on his arm and steadied him. "There, there, dear," she said. "Nothing to be frightened of. I'm sure it's not serious. How do you feel?" "Not very good," said Henry. The light turned off. "Warm?" "No." "Cold?" "No." "Dizzy?" "No. I just feel strange." "You poor dear," said Nurse Molly. "You must really be frightened." She ran her fingers through his hair and patted the back of Henry's neck. Somehow this made him feel a little better. "Pop!" "Did you say something?" Nurse Molly asked. "No, ma'am," said Henry. "Pop!" "What was that noise, then?" she asked. "It sounds like something's going pop." "I heard it, too," said Henry. "So did I," said Mrs. Kimmelfarber. "Pop, pop, pop!" Now they all heard it. The sound of popping filled the nurse's office. Little pops and bigger pops and pippity-pop-pops kept popping. Henry looked at his arm and in an instant knew where the noise was coming from. His little brown spots were growing bigger and bigger, and they were popping out all over him. No longer the size of freckles. They were as big as chocolate bits his mother used for making cakes and cookies. He could feel them popping out on his arms and his face. He could feel them growing under his shirt. In less time than it takes to tell, Henry Green was covered with little brown lumps from the top of his head to the tips of his toes. And tomorrow we will read 2 more chapters.